On September the 21st, 1944, in a basement that smelled of wet brick and pickled onions, Captain Elliot made a ceremony out of survival. He poured the last clean water in his canteen into a chipped mug, drew a razor along his jaw until the stubble surrendered, and wiped the blade on a handkerchief that had once been white. The shave steadied his hands and narrowed his thoughts, and that narrowness felt like control. The cost was simple. Every careful stroke spent what the wounded upstairs needed more than his face ever did. He saved a finger's depth in the mug and held it back as if restraint were still a weapon. The man on the mattress in the next room had a chest wound and lips like paper. Elliot could have offered him a sip, but water shared became water gone, and then the next man would beg. Elliot capped the mug, slid it into his kit, and convinced himself that keeping order was the same as keeping life. The result was that he stayed upright when others collapsed. The cost was that he felt the first sting of what would later become habit, choosing who suffered so he could keep functioning. He climbed the steps with his collar buttoned and his chin smooth, and the city above punished him for it. A mortar bomb landed near the improvised casualty recess. Sandbags, doors ripped from hinges, a tarp that had been a curtain, and tore it open as if a hand had clawed it. Men shouted for stretchers and then stopped shouting because names do not answer when the lungs are gone. Elliot pulled his field manual from his map case and found its edges curled black, pages stuck with soot and blood. He forced it open for the comfort of headings and procedures, and the paper tore like cloth. The result was a silence inside his head where instructions should have been. The cost was the first clear knowledge that rules did not protect men, they only made dying look orderly. He tried to buy order anyway. A number 22 wireless set sat on a crate in a roofless room, its aerial wire looped through a window frame like a vein tied off with string. Elliot knelt beside the operator, checked the frequency settings with fingers that wanted to be decisive, and spoke into the microphone with the clipped calm of training. Static answered, then a half call sign, then nothing. The operator adjusted the tuning and swore that the set had worked yesterday. Elliot knew why it failed today without needing a lecture. Broken aerials, damp air, smashed buildings, and the stubborn fact that the battle had scattered the division into pockets that could not hear one another. The result was that he had no reliable voice to higher command. The cost was time, because each minute spent pleading with the air was a minute the enemy used to tighten the streets. Outside, Arnhem sounded wrong. In training, gunfire had rhythm. Here it came in uneven sheets, machine guns in short, angry saw strokes, rifles answering from corners, a heavy thump that might have been a tank gun or an artillery round landing too close to call. Elliot stepped into a doorway and tried to sight the bridge district through smoke. Somewhere beyond the roofs, men were still holding the north end of the bridge as if stubbornness could weld steel back into a plan. The result was that the bridge became a thought he could not reach and could not abandon. The cost was distraction, because staring toward an objective you cannot influence is a way of letting your own responsibilities drift. A runner arrived with mud on his cheeks and a note smeared by sweat. Units were pulling back toward Oosterbeek, toward a defensive ring forming on the western edge of town. Elliot read it twice. Arnhem had been briefed as a bridge on a road. Take it fast, and armored columns would follow the corridor north. Operation Market Garden had promised speed as a substitute for weight, and now speed had expired. The result was a new mission that felt like defeat dressed as prudence. Withdraw, if withdrawal was still possible. The cost was that he would have to carry wounded through a city already turning into a trap, while pretending the trap was merely difficult terrain. He gathered what remained of his people by calling names and accepting the ones who answered. 2 stretcher-bearers with hands swollen from lifting, a radio operator with a battery that was dying like a lung, 3 riflemen with ammunition counted in handfuls, and the wounded? Because the wounded were the reason he still needed an order at all. The result was a shape that resembled a platoon. The cost was that its edges were frayed. Men who should have been present were already missing, swallowed by rubble, smoke, or capture. He found Private Miller behind a low wall of bricks, searching a dead German for food with hands that moved fast and shamelessly. Miller's hair was matted. His eyes were bright with the alertness of a man who had lived by reading danger before it spoke. Elliot snapped a reprimand, demanded name and unit. tried to turn theft into discipline. Miller's mouth was already full of chocolate, and his grin did not ask permission. The result was disgust, and beneath it, envy. The cost was that Elliot saw how hunger and fear made the private more practical than any paragraph in his ruined manual. Elliot could have made an example of him in another war. Here, hierarchy required witnesses and time and a rear area that still existed. He swallowed the rebuke he wanted and asked a question that scraped his pride raw: whether Miller knew a way to St. Eusebius Church. Miller answered with a tilt of his head, not a salute, and started moving without waiting for permission. The result was a reversal that Elliot felt in his bones, the officer following the man who knew the streets. The cost was that Elliot's pride had to be spent like ammunition. St. Eusebius still stood above smashed roofs, its tower a landmark visible even through smoke. Height meant one thing: signal. Elliot ordered Miller to stay within arm's reach, not because he trusted him, but because he could not afford to lose the only man who moved like he belonged in ruins. The result was a small column moving out, 2 stretcher bearers, a radio operator, the worst wounded who could still breathe, and Miller kept close enough to grab. The cost was exposure, because every meter toward the tower was a meter into streets owned by machine guns. They moved along building edges because the road's center belonged to fire. Elliot watched windows for muzzle flashes and listened for the lazy pause before a machine gun chose a new lane. The wounded moaned and the sound carried. They passed a house with a child's bicycle half buried in plaster, and Elliot felt his mind try to make that detail into a story of civilian life continuing. The result was that he had to shove the impulse down because stories were a luxury he could not carry. The cost was that he became harder inside, the way stone becomes harder when it is fired. At a corner where a shop sign hung by one bolt, a patrol came into view, helmets low, rifles loose, moving like men who knew their side was growing stronger by the hour. Elliot pressed the group into a doorway and watched Miller's eyes flick toward an alley that would take him away from responsibility. The result was a moment where Miller could have vanished. The cost was the knowledge that Elliot's whole plan relied on a man who had lived by slipping out of other people's plans. Miller started to step back. Elliot moved without words, putting his own body into the gap and blocking the patrol's line of sight. His clean-shaved jaw became cover. The patrol passed without turning its heads. The result was that Miller stayed, because he had been spared under Elliot's shadow. The cost was that Elliot felt his pride die in a small, painful place. He had risked himself for a man he had not respected, and that fact could not be undone. They reached the church precinct and found it already wounded. The nave was blackened. The windows were empty squares, the smell of burnt wood mixed with damp stone. Elliot led them inside and felt every footstep echo off hollow walls. The result was concealment inside a structure that still stood. The cost was that echo in a ruined church was a way of announcing yourself to anyone hunting. Progress became mechanical. Rubble blocked aisles. Charred beams leaned like broken ribs. The stretcher-bearers had to lift, pivot, crawl. Elliot took the front handle once, not to be kind, but to feel the weight himself and prove he was still connected to the work. The result was that his shoulders burned and his hands slipped in blood. The cost was that exhaustion stole precision, and precision was the only thing separating movement from panic. Miller slid ahead through gaps too small for an officer's pride and found a side stairwell. He tested each step with the care of a thief listening for a sleeping landlord, then signaled Elliot forward with 2 fingers, no words. The result was a route upward, toward tower rooms where wires and height might still be used. The cost was that Elliot had to follow a private who had been picking pockets minutes earlier, and following scraped him more than fear did. Halfway up, the radio operator stumbled and nearly dropped the set. Elliot caught the strap, steadied the operator with a hand on his collar, and felt the humiliating truth. The radio was not equipment. It was a fragile creature that needed nursing. The result was that they reached the landing without losing the set. The cost was that Elliot's patience once a virtue, became a liability measured in seconds. At a landing, a door hung half open. Beyond it sat a room with a desk, a cracked mirror, and a field set wired into the building as if the church had become a machine. Elliot stepped through first, rifle up, trying to reclaim leadership by arriving ahead of the man he distrusted. The result was that he saw the enemy before he saw the equipment. The cost was that this next decision would not be solved by competence alone. Major Meyer stood inside the radio room, as if he had been there all night. His uniform was dusty, his eyes were clear, and his left cheek was split by a fresh wound he was stitching closed with steady fingers while he watched his reflection. He did not raise his voice. The result was that the room shrank into a courtroom, with Elliot's rank reduced to decoration. The cost was that Elliot's instinct to dominate with authority became useless against a man who dominated by refusing to show fear. Elliot did not fire. Firing would have turned the stairwell into a funnel of bodies and made the church a beacon. He lowered his rifle a fraction and spoke anyway, because speaking was the only weapon that might keep his wounded alive. The result was a negotiation that began without either man naming it as such. The cost was that Elliot had already admitted, by choosing words over bullets, that he was short on options. Meyer answered with a timetable, not an insult. He spoke of German strength increasing by the hour, of battle groups closing in, of streets being cleared block by block. He did not claim grand strategy. He claimed local certainty, the kind that comes from having enough men to keep patrols moving. Elliot did not need to be told about the plan's original assumptions. Few defenders, quick relief, because the streets outside had already corrected them. The result was a countdown Elliot could match to the distant thud of guns and the rising crackle of fires. The cost was that his choices narrowed to an obscene arithmetic. Which deaths were acceptable in exchange for which lives? Elliot asked about the bridge, about the men who had held the north end of the bridge as if stubbornness could weld steel back into a plan. Meyer said only that stubbornness did not stop shells. He let the sentence hang, as if he were offering Elliot the dignity of drawing his own conclusion. The result was the collapse of the heroic story Elliot had been repeating, hold until the tanks arrive, into the plain truth that relief was late, radios were failing, and the pocket was shrinking. The cost was betrayal, not by a man, but by the idea that courage could substitute for logistics. Behind Elliot, Miller shifted, silent. Elliot felt the private assessing exits and angles, measuring survival without ceremony. It was the same calculation Elliot was making, only Miller did not pretend it was noble. The result was a sharp, humiliating clarity. Elliot's certainty had been theatre. The cost was that he had to speak in a language officers avoid, need, while an enemy listened. He made the offer that turned him into someone else. He said he would withdraw his men and move the wounded toward the western perimeter if Meyer granted a ceasefire long enough to carry them through open streets. He said he would not use the pause to attack, and he said it like a man reciting terms in a business office. The result was a shift from combat to transaction. The cost was that Elliot had to treat human suffering as currency, and currency stains the hand that counts it. Meyer did not answer with talk of honor. He answered with talk of verification. He said a ceasefire could exist only if it could be confirmed without trusting British goodwill, because trust was not a resource either side possessed. The result was the shape of a contract, a pause built on mechanism. The cost was that mechanism would require a risk that could be seen and judged by both sides. Elliot glanced at the cracked mirror and at the tower stairs beyond the doorway. The church's height could be used as proof. Its bell machinery was metal and solid. Its upper rooms offered line and reach. A signal could be transmitted at a set minute, short, coded, unmistakable. And if it came, it would bind the pause to something external to words. The result was a workable method that did not depend on sentiment. The cost was that it demanded a man in the tower, exposed long enough to make the method real. Meyer stated the condition plainly. At a set minute, a brief transmission would be sent from the tower, confirming withdrawal and wounded evacuation, and Meyer would order local fire to pause for that window. If the signal did not come, the guns would resume and the streets would be swept. The result was a bargain that turned a man into a required component. The cost was that Elliot's mind began to calculate sacrifice before it had the decency to ask for volunteers. Elliot felt the old logic rise: spend the expendable, preserve the officer, save the unit. His mouth formed the start of an order. Then he saw, in the mirror's cracked edge, his own face, clean, controlled, and suddenly obscene. And he did what his upbringing had taught him never to do in front of an enemy. He dropped to one knee. He did not beg. He offered himself as guarantor, as if rank could still purchase time. The result was a brief tightening in Meyer's eyes, recognition between professionals who understood responsibility, even when systems collapsed. The cost was that Elliot's pride broke in the open, where it could not be repaired. The kneel changed Miller more than any speech could have. Elliot heard the private's breath catch, as if the act had rewritten the hierarchy. Before Elliot could speak again, Miller stepped forward and reached past him for the microphone cable. His hands were quick, and the gesture was not obedient. It was decisive, like a man taking a tool he had earned. The result was a sudden shift. The private acted as a party to the contract. The cost was that Elliot had to watch another man claim agency, and watching is harder than commanding. Miller leaned close enough that Elliot could smell smoke on his clothes. "Save the shaving water, sir," he said, flat and almost amused. "I want to see what it tastes like when we get back." The result was a joke that made the bargain human again. The cost was that humor in Arnhem was a farewell in disguise, and Elliot understood it. Meyer watched without interruption, as if this was simply the solution to his verification problem. Elliot tried to object, but the objection died. Miller turned toward the tower stairwell with a radio line coiled over his shoulder and began to climb. The result was the start of the contract's execution. The cost was that Elliot let him go, and letting go became an action Elliot would relive in every quiet hour afterward. Elliot followed to the bottom of the tower stairs and held the handset to his ear. Boots thudded above, then faded. The transmission began as noise, then broke into fragments. Each time Miller's voice returned, it carried fewer words and more breath. Elliot adjusted the handset angle, as if his hands could improve reception, and forced himself not to climb after him. The result was a discipline made of restraint. The cost was helplessness, because restraint is only virtue when you have other choices. A burst of gunfire cracked close. Dust sifted down, and Elliot heard a short swear clipped by pain. The signal dropped, then returned with a thin, wavering thread of sound. He heard metal clank, an ugly mechanical click that did not belong to any weapon, and then another, as if a gear had shifted under load. The result was evidence that Miller had reached the bell machinery and was turning it into an antenna by force. The cost was the dawning certainty that force in that space meant flesh being used where wire should have been. Elliot pictured the tower interior as a system, because his mind needed systems to survive. He imagined gears the size of wheels, shafts slick with soot, the broken aerial wire being pressed to metal and held there by whatever weight remained of a man. The result was that he could almost believe the work was technical rather than mortal. The cost was denial, because the only reason a man would splice wire with his body in a bell tower was that his body was the last available material. The transmission steadied for one brief stretch, long enough for Elliot to catch the coded confirmation. The next moment, it dipped again, replaced by breathing and another mechanical click, as if the tower was swallowing a man and spitting out a signal. Then the world changed. The distant thud of artillery softened into a pause that felt unnatural, like a city holding its breath after a threat. The result was a ceasefire window that existed because the contract's mechanism had been met. The cost was that the window was narrow, and narrow windows demand that someone be left behind. Elliot used the lull like a lever. He pushed the wounded forward in groups, ordered the stretcher bearers to trade gentleness for speed, and kept his eyes on windows that might decide to ignore the pause. The result was movement, bodies crossing open ground without being cut in half. The cost was pain paid twice, once to be wounded, and again to be carried like cargo under a timer. In the first open street, one stretcher-bearer froze, hearing a distant rifle crack and expecting the ceasefire to end instantly. Elliot grabbed the man's sleeve and dragged him forward, because fear could waste the entire bargain in a heartbeat. The result was that the group kept moving when instinct told them to stop. The cost was that Elliot had to become brutal to prevent panic, and brutality is a kind of self-injury when you are trying to remain decent. At an intersection where tram lines curved like black scars, a man slipped from a stretcher and tried to crawl. Elliot grabbed his wrist and felt a pulse that was weak but present. He hauled him back up, refusing to abandon a living man to keep a schedule. The result was a delay that tightened Elliot's chest, because he could feel the ceasefire shrinking. The cost was that two others took more weight and began to tear under it, and Elliot knew he was spreading damage to keep one conscience clean. They reached cover near the edge of the western perimeter, where exhausted soldiers pulled the wounded into deeper shelter. A corporal with eyes like raw meat counted heads and cursed at the shortage as if curses were inventory. Elliot released the last stretcher handle and found his hands shaking. The result was that the contract had delivered its product. A handful of men alive, who would have died in the street. The cost was that the product did not include the man who had made delivery possible. Elliot should have stayed. He should have turned west, disappeared into the logic of the pocket, and let the tower remain a story told by someone else. Instead, he turned back toward the church, because he could not accept execution without seeing its price. The result was a choice that made no tactical sense and perfect moral sense. The cost was that he risked missing the only chance to save himself. The streets back to St. Eusebius were emptier than before, and emptiness in a city like Arnhem was a warning. Elliot kept to shadow, stepped over a smashed bicycle, and tasted smoke each time he breathed. He reached the church and found fresh bullet chips on the tower stone, white scars tallying near hits. The result was proof that someone had tried to cut the tower down while it was being used. The cost was that proof made Miller's last minutes feel not heroic, but hunted. In the tower base, Elliot looked up into a shaft of blackness and called Miller's name once. The sound did not return. The result was an answer made of silence. The cost was that the mind resists void and searches for objects to hold, because void is where guilt breeds. He found an object near the bottom of the stairs, a rusted fighting knife beside torn wire whose copper innards had been scraped bare. Elliot picked up the knife, and the rust bit his palm through a smear of dried blood. He followed the wire with his eyes until it vanished upward, as if the line itself were pointing at where the price had been paid. The result was proof Miller had been here, had worked, and had not come down with his tools. The cost was responsibility, because proof turns a death into a debt with a name. Footsteps sounded behind him, measured and unhurried. Elliot spun with his rifle raised. Major Meyer stood in the doorway, his stitched cheek darker now, and he held a red beret, snagged, torn, airborne cloth made into a receipt. He offered it without speaking. The result was confirmation that the contract had been honored by the only measure that mattered. The enemy had chosen to deliver evidence instead of taking it as loot. The cost was contradiction, because the same man who honored a bargain was also a man who would have flattened the district if the signal had failed. Elliot took the beret and felt the fabric damp and cold. He did not ask how it had been found, because asking would have required a narrative of the fall, and he could not afford that picture. The result was a second piece of proof that fixed the transaction in the world. The cost was that proofs demand accounting, and Elliot had no arithmetic that could make the exchange fair. They stood in the ruined tower base with the ceasefire's last seconds hanging over them. Elliot raised his hand in a salute, not to Germany and not to Britain, but to the fact that a contract had been kept under conditions designed to make contracts impossible. Meyer returned the salute with the precision of a man who treated discipline as self-preservation. The result was mutual recognition between two professionals who had just used a human life as a mechanism. The cost was risk, because if either man had been seen by his own side, the story would have ended with bullets from friendlier guns. The pause ended without announcement. A first returning thump of artillery rolled across the district, and the air seemed to tighten. Meyer stepped back into smoke and disappeared, choosing withdrawal the way Elliot had chosen it, because withdrawal was the only remaining competence. The result was separation without promise. The cost was that Elliot would carry the receipt alone. Elliot ran west until the church was behind him and the pocket swallowed him. His war ended not with victory, but with surrender and capture, the kind that comes when ammunition becomes a rumor and the wounded outnumber the able. He marched under guard with other airborne men, crossing ground that had been promised as a corridor to Germany, and now served only as a route into captivity. The result was that his body remained intact. The cost was that his identity as a man who controlled outcomes was replaced by the identity of a prisoner who endured them. In the prisoner of war camp, Elliot shaved every morning again, even when water was cold and scarce. He traded cigarettes for a few extra cupfuls, scraped his face until it stung, and refused to let stubble become the camp's uniform. The result was a ritual that gave him a line to stand on when everything else was mud. The cost was that the ritual no longer belonged to pride. It belonged to debt. Each stroke felt like a silent apology to the man who had joked about shaving water and then had turned his body into wiring. Elliot kept the rusted knife hidden through inspections, and the effort taught him a new discipline: secrecy as devotion. At night, when the camp was loud with coughing and quiet with shame, he held the knife and heard again the mechanical click from the tower, metal shifting under strain. He began to hear that click in harmless sounds: a latch, a spoon against a cup, because the mind stores what it cannot repay. The result was an anchor he could not be forced to drop. The cost was that the anchor dragged. It kept him from believing in clean stories about duty. When the gates finally opened and he walked out, he returned to a country that wanted narratives, bold drops, brave stands, gallant failure, and he discovered his own story did not fit. He could describe the bridge, the smoke, the withdrawals, but he could not describe the kneel and the contract without turning himself into a man people would avoid. The result was silence. The cost was isolation, because silence protects others from discomfort, but leaves the speaker alone with images. Years later, in a quiet room with a basin and a razor laid out like an instrument, Elliot still shaved with care. He did it not for inspection and not for the illusion that a smooth jaw could organize chaos, but to refuse forgetting. He kept the red beret folded away and the knife wrapped in cloth, never as trophies. The result was a man who lived and paid attention. The cost was that he lived as if carrying a grave in his pocket, because some systems only function inside the supply that feeds them, and when the supply breaks, men become the parts that replace what is missing.